Hello, welcome back. Today, we're going to continue talking about the family, but I want to shift the focus here. The last time that we met, I spoke about family formation, I spoke about marriage and partnerships, and I spoke at length about the process of assortative mating and the pressures that are often put on people, either endogamous or exogamous, to select mates within or outside of a very specific social group. Today, I want to shift the focus to thinking about children because uh, there are extra special IRB regulations on the study of children. The sociological research on childhood itself is not super well developed, although some people have and continue to do some really good and interesting work on studying children. This is not usually something that we don't know a ton about the process here. That's the word I really want to establish and really drive home here. Childhood is about process. What we often have, at least in my area, somebody like me that makes a living off of regression models and statistical analysis, we have a general idea of how you were born based on geographical place of birth, obviously, and a general idea of what your parents' income was at the time of your birth. And then we know where you ended up as a result, where you ended up as an adult. So quite often we know and we understand where you started and where you ended up. But childhood is a process. Childhood is a process of growing up inside that starting point and end point that has a tremendous impact on what ultimately happens to you as an adult. So here's what I would like to accomplish today. I want to evaluate some of the data on childhood. I want to talk about child rearing and try to make a larger social point, a point about social class, because several sociologists argue, and I think they have very strong points, that the way in which different social classes raise their children is different. And that has consequences for what types of adults are ultimately produced through that child rearing process. Okay. So that's the plan for today. I'll start with a little bit of review and just go back to this quote from Monday, where Stephanie Kuntz writes that there is no single traditional family that exists to which we could return. We've eliminated culturally a whole bunch of a lot of the diversity of family structures that existed, way back in the day, and only hold up the two-parent nuclear suburban family as kind of the cultural representation of what life was like. And even if we wanted to go back to that, it would likely be doomed to failure, because those cultural values, right, those family structures emerged out of broader social structure. And in the absence of that original social structure, you will be unable to replicate the family that existed in that time, because the situation that we are living through right now is simply not something that could easily be adapted to those norms. I talked about what that meant for parents, right, for men and women, for partnerships and marriage. What does that mean for children? That's the big question today. What does that mean for children? Let's take a look at some of the data on this. What you're seeing here is the living arrangements, what percentage of children living in the following living arrangements, and how that has changed from 1960 through the mid part of the last decade. There are two, there are three main trends that we observe. The first is a relative decline of two-parent families. So you can see in 1960, you had 73% of children living with two parents in their first marriage. By 2014, that was down to 46, less than half of all children. We see a rise of blended families. So that would be, let's say, two parents in remarriage or cohabitating parents. That has gone from 14%, or 14 and 9% respectively, up to 15% and 26%. And cohabitation is also part of this too. Two parents not in a marriage, that's 7%. Although a lot of long-term cohabitations very much approximate a marriage, even if it's not legally designated as such. And then the rise of single parenthood. We can see that that has gone up from 9% to 26%. One out of every 4 children is living with a single parent. So those are the 3 major changes: a decline of those in the traditional 2-parent family, a rise of people in blended families, although I guess the rates on that from 14% up to 16%. Up to 15%. Maybe that's not too much of a change. Single parenthood would be, though, from 9% to 26%. That's like a threefold increase from where we ultimately were. Now, as I have said, analyzing childhood is analyzing process. What happens to children in the process of being in a nuclear family? What happens to children through the process of being in a blended or remarried family? What happens to children who are raised by single parent? What happens to children who are raised by no parent at all? If you're curious about that, what does that mean, no parent? That generally reflects people living with grandparents. That's the overwhelming majority of those living with no parent. They're living with grandparents, which has not really changed all that much. 4%, 5% over the last several decades. Okay, families, as I have said, interact with and intersect with other institutions. The institution of the family, I see it as an institution in its own right, but I also view it as something that can complement any other institution. And so people live their lives with their families, but they're also going to all sorts of other institutions as well. So as a result of this, what we see is that, families spend time together, but families also go to religious services. So that's an intersection between the institution of the family and the institution of the religious system. Children go to school. Okay, so that's an intersection between the family that one is being raised in and the school, the educational institution that they are going to. Parents go work for organizations, businesses, companies, where they spend a large chunk of their time. Like, I spend more time at work than I do at home, and I don't think I'm unique on that. Not anymore. I mean, in the last 3 weeks, I spend a lot more time right here in my panic room making these videos. But parents, so that's an intersection between the family that one resides in and the labor market institution that has brought that person into a business. Families spend leisure time together, but how are they actually spending that leisure time? That's the segue to a question about, do the various social classes raise their children differently? The idea I'm about to go through here is, in my opinion, 1, it's correct, but 2, it's also one of the more interesting ideas that has ever been developed about just mundane, day-to-day boring social activity, just parents spending time with children trying to pass the time in the boardroom of childhood. So do various classes raise their children differently? I think most people would agree, even without the data, even without the theory, that this is probably true, and not just because of money. It's not just that wealthy people make more money than us. They are generally viewing the world in a different way. They are generally observing a different set of social mores than everybody else is. And that creates, that's the socio-cultural impact of economic inequality becoming so ingrained within our social consciousness. So if we go back through this list again, do various classes raise their children differently? Okay, well, families are attending religious services. Are you attending a kind of real working class Catholic congregation, like let's say a Latino working class Catholic congregation or a Southern Baptist congregation? Or are you going to a very wealthy suburban mainline Protestant congregation in like suburban Minneapolis or something? And so that's going to reflect the type of religious service you attend is very much going to reflect social class backgrounds. Children go to school. Are you going to a very well-funded school district out in the suburbs, again, suburban Minneapolis again, or are you going to an inner city school district in New Orleans where it might be easier to get guns and drugs than it is to get textbooks? Parents work in organizations. Are your parents working doing service sector wage work with no health insurance and no benefits and no 401ks? Or are parents working for a major law firm or like white collar work, essentially? Are you in blue collar work or white collar work? That leads the parents to parent differently. Families share leisure time. Are you going to the symphony orchestra with your parents, or are you going to WrestleMania with your parents? Right? Like, these reflect different class positionings. These reflect different ideologies about how families are interacting with one another. So, Annette Leroux, this sociologist I've been quoting over the last couple of days, Annette Leroux argues that there are two average or ideal types of parenting strategies, child rearing strategies, let's say. The first is what Leroux calls the accomplishment of natural growth. In such a system, in such a family unit, generally speaking, most non-school time when you're outside of other institutions is spent in unstructured play. Children are generally responsible for occupying their own time. They're generally responsible for finding ways to entertain themselves, be that by playing outside or be that, by playing with just people who happen to live around them, friend groups that form in neighborhoods, watching television, reading books. Like, you're generally in charge of your own non-school time. So that's the accomplishment. The idea is that the child will figure it out. The child will figure out what they like, what they're good at, where to go through the process of trying things out in a very unstructured way. Now, the counterpoint to this is what Leroux calls concerted cultivation. This is a situation where parents are very actively assessing a child's talents and a child's skills and their interests. And then you get enrolled in very structured activities to support this. Okay, so if we're comparing these two, one is about non-structured playtime and the other is about very structured, organized activities. Just about every American child, male or female, has played soccer at some point in their lives. That's an example of, all right, enroll you in soccer, and you'll learn something through that. You'll learn how to be bored for very long stretches of time. You'll learn how to you'll learn things like teamwork is the hope, but more importantly, if you combine that with everything else that children are enrolled in, right? If you're enrolled in soccer, you're probably not just enrolled in soccer. You're also enrolled in some type of music, instrument lessons and some type of science camp, right? And summer camps that maybe have all sorts of academic themes to them. Why are your parents doing this? I want you to think a little bit about things that your parents signed you up for. Something like gymnastics. There's always somebody that gets signed up for gymnastics whenever I ask this of the class. Why? Why did mom and dad sign you up for gymnastics, or for anything for that matter? Is it because they thought that you were going to go to the Olympics? No, they're putting you in situations where they're figuring out what you're good at, right? Trying to nurture what it is you have, that you as a child are drawn to, and because some of that is internal. There gets to be a point when you're raising a child where the child starts to show things that are like, all right, well, that didn't come from mom and that didn't come from dad. That's just them. That's just you at that point. So the key variable here is much of your time is spent either in structured activities or unstructured activities. I want you to think a little bit about this and conceptualize what were the things that you did when you were growing up, and how did they fit into these two ideal types? Did you generally spend a lot of your free time just sort of hanging around the street, maybe hanging around the neighborhood, hanging around the house? Or did you have all sorts of structured activities that you had to go to, be they soccer, gymnastics, band practice, piano lessons, whatever? It's clear that these are going to reflect different types of social class backgrounds, okay? So let's get into Leroux's definition of social class. She very much ties it not to how much money you make, although that's clearly going to matter here, but she ties it to occupational prestige, which is a very interesting idea here. So let's take a brief detour to theorize about what social classes are generally doing for work. A family that's middle class, according to Leroux, and I think this is a pretty good definition, it's middle class by having at least one parent, maybe two, that are employed in a position that includes substantial managerial authority. They manage things, they work creatively. And that ability to have that type of job is drawing upon educationally certified skills. So by this metric, I would be classified as middle class, if not above middle class, depending on where my income falls in any given year. But the fact that I have a very creative job, I have a lot of managerial authority over what other people are doing, and the educationally certified skills that I got through the process of going to college and going to grad school. So this is almost always, but not exclusively, people with bachelor's degrees or higher. Okay, so there's that effect of a college degree again. Now, working class, according to Leroux, is when you have one parent who is in a position with little to no managerial authority, so the opposite of what we saw in middle class, and it usually is not drawing upon educationally certified skills. This is usually somebody who has finished a high school degree, has finished some type of technical certification, or might just be a dropout entirely and has some type of service sector jobs. So those are the jobs that, even if they pay the bills, not very managerial, they're not very creative, they're not very mentally stimulating. Now, those jobs have to get done in some way or another, but part of the reason you're all in college right now, I would assume, is because you want to have one of these middle-class jobs, and not just so you can pay back debt or something like that, for many reasons, because work is important to how we, to our self-image. The very well-known classical sociologist Karl Marx. Did you know Marx was a sociologist? Yeah, he had an idea about work that I very much believe. Marx believed that work was not just something you did to make money. He believed and argued very strongly that work was required for people to live a fully flourishing life. It was the way that we expressed the creativity that was part of our human nature. It was essential to being happy, was to being fulfilled at work. All right. And so it's clear to see that the middle class jobs that are more creative and more stimulating are likely to draw students in a little bit more, are likely to be just more emotionally fulfilling than what you see among the working class families. And then finally, lower class, Leroux defines, and this is pretty easy to define, parents who are not regularly in the labor force. Okay, fair enough. Ready to continue? Okay, so in terms of parenting, the place that somebody works at is going to affect the type of life they want to give their children, and not just in terms of the money that they can afford to spend on them, because that's easy. It's very easy to say, okay, well, rich parents have more money to spend on their children. And look, that's certainly accurate, but it's also easy. Like, that's not a particularly interesting sociological point. So child rearing differences, Leroux argues, are flowing from the occupational patterns across the social classes. I think this is a very, very interesting idea. So Leroux argues that in the middle class, what's the key thing that differentiates middle and working and lower classes? It's not just the amount of money that people make, it's that the middle class is in very creative and rewarding work, and the working class is in generally non-creative and non-expressive work. People see this all the time among people in the middle class and above, and upper middle class jobs. People always talk about it's very difficult to separate themselves from the job that they're doing. I would tell you that, like me being a professor is so central to my identity. Really, it is the core component of my personal identity and self-esteem. Really, like I in my mind, this may not be true in other social situations, but in my mind, I think of myself as a professor before I am an American, before I am a man, right? Before I am ethnically German, right? Being a professor is more important to me than any of those other roles or statuses that I might hold. So is work who you are? Is it an expression of who you are, or just what you do? That's an important distinction. In the middle class, they have the ability to say, work is who I am. This is an expression of who I am and what I like and what is personally fulfilling to me. But in the working classes, it's often just something you have to do to pay the bills. It's something you have to do to get by. So the conception of work, you don't think that's going to ripple out? You don't think that's going to affect the way that they choose to parent their children? Among social classes, like structured time versus non-structured time, Leroux's point is that for a variety of reasons, partially money, but also definitely this part of it, concerted cultivation is much more common among the middle class, and natural growth is much more common among the working class. And the big reason for that is cultural, not economic. Because if you have a job that you feel is something that, like, I feel very rewarded at work, I found the thing that I love doing, you want your child to find the thing that they love doing. And that leads to all sorts of structured activities and organized activities to nurture and cultivate a child's pre-existing interest. But if I look at work as just someplace I have to go, like this is just where I have to be 5 days a week, 9 hours a day, 45 hours a week, childhood becomes a break from that. It's my time to not have to deal with those stresses. And therefore, the child's kind of responsible for doing what they want to do at that point. And that comes from the conceptions that people have of work. Okay. And what this leads to is a very different type of relationship with organizations and institutions. So I would ask the class, this is something I'd want people to talk about if we were able to have a discussion about it. How many of your parents at any point in your life have intervened on your behalf in some type of institution? Likely at school up to this point, but maybe it's with a coach, maybe it's something else. I don't know. Either way, it's easy to see who's more likely to do this. Middle-class parents are statistically much more likely to take a very active leadership role in a child's life. And that involves fixing problems for you at school, let's say, or working to embed you in other organizations, getting you signed up for certain things. That's your parents taking a leading role and intervening on your behalf as a child, right? You may not have wanted to go to gymnastics or play soccer, but that's what happened to you, right? Your parents intervened in that way for you. Part of this is an economic angle. I know I keep saying that, but I don't want it to get lost. But probably the bigger part of it is that through your own life experiences, do you have a sense that institutions are something that you actively participate in or something that is just being done to you? Working class households generally view it as the latter, right? It's something, these things are being done to me and I go along with it. But the intervening variable of like being middle class, that gives people much more freedom and an idea that I can take a very active role within these institutions. And that has consequences for children, right? That has consequences for how they conceptualize institutions throughout the life course. So what are the consequences of this? Well, if I look at natural growth, children raised through that accomplishment of natural growth, they generally looked at their lives and they generally looked at institutions they generally looked at their time as very unstructured opportunities throughout the childhood. Children end up growing up with a real sense of constraint. They do not feel like institutions are malleable to their interests or their desires or their needs, let's say. But in concerted cultivation, the child develops a real sense of entitlement. And I don't mean that in a bad way. We always say entitlement is a bad thing. No, it just means that we view institutions as something that is serving me, right? It's something that I'm entitled to certain treatment within this institution, and that empowers children. That puts them on a different type of pathway throughout their adult lives. In natural growth, the child learns to very much adopt these constraints, and the way that their parents interacted with institutions, the child is then likely to mimic that when they themselves become adults. and it's a primary way in which inequality is reproduced throughout society. It's always going to have an economic angle, but it very much has a sociocultural angle as well. Now, on the other hand, the more organizations that you've had, dominate your life, you start to learn some freedom in that because you've been in more of them. You've been embedded in more organizations and institutions, and you personally have been, you have seen intervening behavior in those institutions modeled for you by your parents. Okay? Once people get to school, that's the institution that tends to most severely separate people by natural growth and concerted cultivation. If you think about what types of skills are rewarded at different levels of the education system, when children are in primary school, so in elementary school, what helps you really get by and do well there? Are you prompt? Are you on time? Can you sit still? Can you follow directions? Can you sit still and look pretty? Those are all things that concerted cultivation teaches children. They've been in more organizations. They've been around more authority figures. Whereas with natural growth, when you can do kind of whatever it is that you want to do in childhood, that does not translate well to the fourth grade classroom. It just doesn't, right? And that leads to this child falling behind or being labeled as a problem student, or being labeled as just maybe not a problem, but just not a very bright student. And that type of labeling has consequences. By the time you get to secondary school, it's much more about creativity and being able to think outside the box. And the types of institutions that people have signed up for, like you think about the camps and all sorts of other things that middle-class children have gone to, they can develop and cultivate those skills in a way that children who experience a lot more freedom in their day-to-day routine are just not able to. Now, obviously, there are always going to be exceptions, but it's by no means like these exceptions end up proving the rule. And then once you get to, tertiary education, it's much more about freedom in curriculum. Like, do you view college as something that's happening to you or something that you have a lot of control over? Middle class children are able to approach college with less of an adjustment and less of a culture shock to what do I need to do to be successful here? Like, you think in high school, the institution's kind of being done to you. In high school, you kind of get your curriculum given to you. Here's your schedule, right? In freshman year, you take biology, and in sophomore year, you take chemistry, and junior year, you take physics. And I don't know what happens in senior year. I guess an elective, maybe not, maybe not. That's the point. You don't know. And then you get to college, and it's like, okay, 4 units, figure it out. Some students are much more able to thrive in that type of environment than others. And Leroux argues, I think not wrongly, that it comes from these class differences, from how willing and how likely are you to be able to handle that increase in institutional freedom that is afforded and cultivated within the middle class. So another part of this also is, if you're wondering why children are being signed up for things at earlier and earlier and younger ages, one of the enduring legacies of economic inequality is parents are just taking a much more active role in shaping a child's life, because the consequences of not making it through college are pretty severe at this point. The consequences of not making it through to a very good job, a middle class job, are pretty severe at this point. So parents for their side of it, of the child rearing, are much more, if they're able to, are much more active in saying, I need to take a leading role in shaping my child's future. That leads to a tremendous amount of stress and overscheduling on you for you guys. But it's easy for me to see and understand why parents are very interested in doing that. And so ultimately then, what parents really bestow upon you, the number one thing Leroux argues that parents give to children, it's not money, it's not inheritances, it's not your grandma's recipes. The most valuable thing they can impart upon you is what's known as cultural capital. So the three major forms of capital, according to the great French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, are social capital, economic capital, and cultural capital. So economic capital, money, wealth, it's what you have. Social capital is your networks, who you know and how well you know them. Cultural capital is kind of a measure of what you know and which one of these and what types of knowledge give you a leg up in navigating elite social settings. Now, he was writing about France when he wrote this, but just change the French examples to other things and other nationally specific things, and I very much think it applies here. What do you know? Take something like leisure time. Did you learn how to play golf growing up, or did you learn how to play spades? Where spades is very much a working class card game, played very often in the American South, but in other parts of the world, other parts of the country as well. Which one of those is going to help you if you get a corporate job, right? Your boss doesn't know how to play spades, but your boss might invite you to play golf. That's something that's that's a piece of cultural capital that can push you forward, even though golf sucks and is not fun. But it's a high culture, high class leisure activity. Taste, right? What types of food do you like? What did you when can you appreciate fine French and South African wines, or are you drinking Miller High Life, right? These are things, it's all just alcohol. It's the same thing, except it isn't. One of those things is going to help you navigate elite settings a little bit more. Styles of dress, I'll actually never forget this. There was a moment, my first year here at Albion, I was packing up my office. I was getting ready to leave for the day, and a student comes into my office from my intro class, actually, and says, "Dr. Schoen, you have to help me." And I'm thinking, oh, shit, what is this here? Because I'm pretty fortunate. I've never once had a student ever put me in an uncomfortable position, and so I'm wondering what this is. But all it was is this student needed somebody to show him very, very quickly on very short notice how to tie a tie, because he had a Skype interview he had to get on and he didn't know how to tie a tie. And that's one of those things, like, a tie is just a piece of clothing, but it's what men in professional environments need to wear. And so, I tied my tie for him, kind of loosened it, gave it to him, and that allowed him to, to tighten it up and do his job interview. What does this have to do with social class? Well, again, do you have someone in your life that can teach you how to tie a tie at a fairly young age? I knew how to tie a tie. But I had this student, I followed up with him, like, "Hey man, how'd the interview go? Did you get the job?" And so I had this kind of talk with him about it, where it became pretty clear. He never outright said this, but it became pretty clear that, he grew up in an environment where there just wasn't an older man in his life that was able to show him how to tie a tie. So that's why he came to me to see if I was there, just for no other reason but that he saw that I usually wear a tie to teach, and he knew I knew what to do and would have one generally on me. So parents ultimately, the child rearing process is one where parents are providing children with this type of cultural knowledge of how to act in general settings and social situations, and that helps them develop more confidence, but also more experience in navigating these smooth institutions. And that's the process, right? The process of imparting this non-quantifiable knowledge from parents to child. That's the process that Leroux is very much interested in. Many, so the sociologists of culture are interested in. Right? So I hope that you think a little bit more critically about how you were raised. What decisions did your parents make? What decisions and what were your parents' motives with the decisions that they ultimately made? I am of the belief, I think when you look out there at the world, there are good parents and there are bad parents. But I guess deep down, I believe that parents universally do want what is best for their child. Even if they don't always do the right thing, they want what's best for their child. I don't know. Maybe I just want to believe that. I'm not sure. But either way, it's the process of how children get there that really matters here. So think about whether you fell into this accomplishment of natural growth, or this concerted cultivation strategy, and what that's meant for you as you have entered young adulthood. How has that influenced how you operate through college? How has that influenced the decisions you've made for what you want to study? These are uncomfortable things to critically examine, but we're better off if we ultimately do. So anyway, that's what I got for you today. Think a lot about your childhood. That's my homework for you the rest of the way. Thank you very much. Take care of yourselves. Talk to you later.